European Security Initiative. We also vigilantly following the national security challenges. We explore how to counter terrorism and violent extremism, as we did with our Crime Terror Nexus project and GlobSec Intelligence Reform Initiative. Our Democracy and Resilience program is tenaciously analyzing hybrid threats to our democracy and runs hands-on projects to make our democracies and the way we share and consume information ever more resilient in the digital age. We explore challenges facing our economy, intersections of technology and society, energy and sustainability, and global order. We're always open for collaboration. Stay in touch with us. Do not hesitate to approach us with your thoughts, ideas, and suggestions. And we promise you that you will hear from us regularly about our ideas and what we do to convert them into reality. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alina Kutsko, and I'm director of the GlobSec Policy Institute, broadcasting from Bratislava. Welcome to our last session of the day, titled Crafting Transatlantic Responses to the Challenge of Belarus. The session is organized in cooperation with our great partners from the Atlantic Council, for which we are very grateful. Here with me are a set of fantastic speakers. Ambassador Michal Zibert, who is Director for Eastern Europe, Caucasus and Central Asia at the Federal Foreign Office of the Federal Republic of Germany. Prime Minister Carl Bildt, who is currently co-chair at the European Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin, and Ambassador Daniel Fried, who is currently Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council, Washington, D.C. Belarusians have captivated the world with their unprecedented and inspiring social and political mobilization. We all know that the peaceful defiance of the population had been intensifying throughout the summer and culminated with the mass demonstrations that followed the disputed elections and a brutal crackdown on peaceful protesters. But Alexander Lukashenko seems to have no intentions of resigning anytime soon. So the question that is on everybody's mind is, what's next? Today, even at our conference, Belarus has come up in pretty much all the previous discussions, which means that also policymakers and experts in Europe and beyond are trying to wrangle their minds about what approaches and responses we can jointly develop to address the situation in the country. Ambassador Zibert, I'm going to turn first to you. Could you please unwrap for us what is currently being discussed in Europe and what is the European response look like?
Thank you very much for having me, Alina. I am happy to start by saying that I'm sitting here only a few meters from the Weltsaal in our Foreign Office, where tomorrow morning the Gymnich meeting of the European Union will convene. Of course, I can't tell you what these 27 foreign ministers and the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Policy will exactly discuss. But I will start by saying that the European Union has very early on reacted to the situation in Belarus. The foreign ministers, as we all know, met on the 14th of August, and there was a special European Council on the 19th of August with a very clear targeted message. Namely saying that the European Union does not recognize the result of the rigged elections, that we have the intention to decide about targeted sanctions against those responsible for A, the rigging of the election, and B, of the human rights violation and violence against demonstrations. Also, we have urged for a national dialogue between the government and the opposition in Belarus. and we have announced more support for the civil society in Belarus. And now tomorrow, I'm sure that this line will be reaffirmed. The foreign ministers will make the point about where we stand. Unfortunately, we have to say that the developments in Belarus in recent days have not been as positive as one or the other may have hoped. Namely, the offer that was made by the OSCE to mediate in the conflict and to organize kind of a national dialogue between government and opposition has not been picked up at all by the authorities. On the contrary, the repression has continued, maybe in a smarter way. So we will have to assess the situation, and I'm sure targeted sanctions, maybe even a longer list than initially planned, will be decided upon. And the main thing is not how many people exactly will be put on such a list, but the main thing, I guess, is the unanimity and the decisiveness of the European Union to go ahead. And I have optimism that we will find this common line, and then that we implement these measures as quickly as possible. I may add that we would like to, of course, discuss possible sanctions lists with our friends in the US, in the UK, Canada, etc., to align them as much as possible. Maybe I stop here responding to your first question.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Indeed, this unanimity is of crucial importance to not just to find the common grounds in the EU, but to send a very strong message. And once you mentioned the American friends, I'm going to switch to Ambassador Fried and ask him a similar question about the United States. Ambassador Fried, many observers are saying that the US is not particularly visible, or potentially somewhat less visible than the European Union in its response. Is it a prudent decision? Could you please unwrap for us what's going on and what is the thinking towards Belarus? And if you would like to touch also on the outcomes of the trip of the Deputy Secretary Bigun to Lithuania and Moscow as well.
Well, first, I want to express my agreement with the path ahead that Ambassador Siebert outlined. I think that's the right approach. I think the United States should work as closely as possible with the European Union. We should move in the same direction. I think that speaking clearly and imposing individual sanctions on the Russian officials responsible for the rigged elections and the repression is a good place to start. I think that we ought to, and having in mind what Ambassador Siebert said, I think we also ought to prepare to support Belarusian society in the long term, because this could be a longer term process. We need to be prepared for it. Finally, and this was the only thing that Ambassador Siebert didn't mention, I think that the United States and Europe should start considering, not implementing, but considering contingency sanctions against Russia should Putin invade, either directly or indirectly. I'm not saying we should actually do it. I don't think we should, but I think we should be prepared, and we should let the Russians know that we are prepared to act as a way of deterring them from intervention directly or indirectly. Now, I think the United States has rhetorically somewhat pulled back. We have made statements, but the Europeans have been in the lead. I think this is right. I think that Deputy Secretary Bigun's trip is well-timed. He's going to the right places. And he, frankly, is the right person to do it. I've known Steve Bigun for 25 years. He is respected by Republicans and Democrats. He's a serious person who knows the issues. He's there with the State Department's George Kent, Deputy Assistant Secretary, who's deeply knowledgeable about these issues. He started off in Vilnius, meeting with Tsikhanouskaya, as well as the Lithuanian foreign minister. then to Moscow. We had meetings yesterday, going on to Kyiv, and then Vienna, OSCE. So I think supporting OSCE mediation is a good idea. Look, this is an issue where the United States and Europe should be at one. And we should be active in the short term, we should prepare for the long term, and we should not assume that the Belarusians, any more than Ukrainians, are going to be satisfied living under tyranny. That is an important message for us all.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, also for highlighting the importance of the coordination between the European Union, European countries, United States, but also Canada and other democratic countries. Prime Minister Bildt, we had a set of measures that were outlined by the European Union and the United States, and I think we all agree on the importance of transatlantic cooperation. From your perspective, do you think this is a sufficient set of measures that will result in the change on the ground, or would you recommend that something else should be done or should be done differently?
Well, thank you. First, we should recognize that so far nothing has been done except statements. I think those statements have, there were some in the very beginning that were not particularly perfect, but otherwise I think the EU line has firmed up quite considerably, notably in the last few days, and that's good. What has been said from the EU side is that one is preparing sanctions. And I think that was positive. There was some fear in the beginning of this particular debate that there would be perhaps one member country who was less keen on sanctions. But it was good at the first video conference of the foreign ministers that everyone agreed with that. Then we should recognize, and both the ambassadors have underlined that, we're in for a fairly long game. I think after the election, Lukashenko expected to get this over with fairly quickly, as has been the case after previous elections. I mean, a couple of days of more or less heavy repression and cutting down the internet, and that was going to be it. That failed. There were some people in the West, perhaps, who believed that there was going to be a Ceausescu moment and Lukashenko was going to just fold and leave for Turkey or Russia or whatever. That did not happen. We are in a stalemate situation at the moment, where Lukashenko is not really controlling the country and where the opposition is not unseating the regime. This might break the one way or the other. That remains to be seen. But I think it's important that the policy is designed to be a policy step by step and for the long haul. As for sanctions, I think I always say that Dan Fried and I have had many discussions on sanctions. Sanctions are effective primarily when you threaten to impose them. So we should threaten to impose them on a fairly large number of people, but we can do it rolling. You can easily start with one list, and when that is implemented, you say that if the situation doesn't improve, we are working on a second list and a third list. And then you move into the different organs of power and of the regime. And I mean, I don't think asset freeze is going to be particularly important, but not being able to travel to the EU is important. Belarus, fairly unknown country to most people, but it's actually the country in the world that has the highest numbers of people having Schengen visas per capita. Lots of people of Belarus, including the regime and administration or whatever, they like to go shopping in Vilnius and other places. And to sort of gradually deprive more and more people that we see associated with or accepting repression or falsification of election results, denying that possibility will over time have some effect. So I think that's an important instrument. Then signaling to Moscow is important. I think that has been done. I think in the last few days there have been slightly too many people calling Moscow. Belarus, the capital of Belarus is Minsk, not Moscow. But an element of signaling to Moscow was, of course, important. And then we have the different long-term support civil society, short and long term. I've been involved in a couple of crises with Belarus, and we set in motion certain programs X numbers of years ago. I can see some of them having had fairly significant effect. I don't think it's appropriate to go into the details of those particular programs, but there's scope for expanding those things further without having press release on every single detail of it. Not expecting that to have an effect tomorrow, not even the day after tomorrow, but the day after tomorrow. And the transformation of Belarus from fairly backward Soviet society and a very sort of backward Soviet economy to a modern European nation, which will happen over time, will take some time. And we must be able to pursue that policy with persistence and with a long-term aim. So get the message out that, yeah, we will not forget Belarus. We will continue, we'll stay the course, and our policy will develop over time in accordance with what we see developments on the ground in Minsk itself.
Thank you so much also for talking about the long-term transformation. In a way, what we see now, this mobilization of society was the outcome of the long-term transformation of the country that was not coming that wasn't necessarily visible from the outside or even sometimes from the inside, but it's definitely a very different society and a very different country that we saw even a few years ago. But you mentioned an important issue of the stalemate, and I would like to go back to Ambassador Zibert and also on the issue of who calls who. We know that, for example, yes, a lot of leaders are calling Moscow and Vladimir Putin, but we also know that and both sides seem to be confirming it, that, for example, Chancellor Merkel did try to call Lukashenko, but Alexander Lukashenko refused to talk to Chancellor Merkel. So, Ambassador Zibert, do you have ideas of how we can get out of this stalemate, especially if there seems to be no efficient and effective way to talk directly to Minsk and encourage the dialogue?
Yeah, $1 million question. You are right that Chancellor Merkel tried to call Lukashenko, and I think the fact that there are fewer contacts there than in Moscow is exactly for that reason, that the responsiveness is so low in Minsk at the moment. I would like to say that I liked the co-panelists saying that it will probably be a mid or long-term game. I don't see a quick way out of the stalemate right now, although the situation may be more fluent, more in flux than we think at the moment. This has been going up and down over the last two weeks. But in recent days, the power of Lukashenko seems to stabilize, and he seems to apply smarter methods to control the situation. I think it is very difficult for us in Western countries to really exercise leverage on the situation, because those in power do not very much respond. We don't want to openly come in on the side of the opposition, because we believe that this is a Belarusian situation and hopefully dialogue. It is not comparable to Kiev in 2013-14. People are not talking about geopolitics and where the country should go. It is an internal discussion about the system of Belarus. So we believe that we should encourage a dialogue along the lines of the current constitution. We offer help by the OSCE because this is an organization Belarus itself belongs to, and Russia as well. So this will be the way forward, but we have the hope that with this very deep politicization of the society that has seemingly suddenly happened, over the last weeks, the situation will never be the same again as it has been before. We don't know how long President Lukashenko will stay in power. We don't know how long he will be supported by Moscow. We don't know whether the economy will play an important role. I mean, the fact that there are strikes, if they will be prolonged, it may be an instrument to weaken the current power. We don't know exactly about future orientation of the security organs, the Siloviki, who at the moment seem to be at the side of Lukashenko, still in the major part. So these are factors we can hardly influence, and we will have to be smart in adjusting to the situation, and of course claiming and demanding that in Belarus the minimum human rights and obligations that Belarus subscribed itself within the OSCE should be maintained and react accordingly. So step-by-step approach, absolutely. This will be a first round also tomorrow, for instance, for the sanctions. And if the situation goes worse in Minsk, the EU, I'm sure, will be prepared to step up and take further action. One more word maybe to Ambassador Fried on the, you were mentioning contingency sanctions discussion on Russia. Not everybody in Europe is convinced of this method, because we believe sanctions are interesting when they are A, targeted, B, reversible in case of the intended action is being taken by the other side, and C, when it is not premeditated and discussed, because it should not be known what kind of sanctions might be taken at what stage, because it makes us more calculable in our actions, and that is not what we want to.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I will complicate what you're saying even further and go back to this discussion about whether it's an internal issue or there should be a discussion also with the actors from the outside, because we know, for example, that Alexander Lukashenko is actively framing the protesters as being financed and directed from abroad, which of course puts the EU and the United States in a very difficult situation about making any statements that are happening in the country. And I wanted to connect it to the discussion about sanctions and Russia. Our audience on the platform is also wondering, and I will switch now to Ambassador Fried, because you mentioned about the topic of sanctions on Russia. What is the threshold on sanctions? Because of course, you mentioned the outright military intervention, which doesn't seem to be something that is in the plans today, but what does seem to be already happening now, at least according to the reports from the country, that there's rather hybrid support from the Russian government in the form, for example, of the journalists that are invited to help the Belarusian state to run the media and PR campaigns. And that's at least something that we even know officially from Alexander Lukashenko himself. So Ambassador Fried, would there be any response or any reaction, diplomatic or public, from the United States or the European Union, whether there should be any response about more subtle methods of Russian support towards the Lukashenko government?
Well, first, I agree with both Carl Bildt and Michael Siebert about the need for unity and the need to think through our steps. We're not neutral in this. We have our principles. That is, we, the West, should stand with Belarusian society, recognizing that they are demanding the right to be heard within their own country. This is not about geopolitics, and we should not introduce that issue, nor should we draw lines on a map and start ruling things out for the Belarusian people. That's up That's not what we should be discussing now, at present. To answer your question about sanctions, we should move ahead promptly on the individual sanctions against Belarusian officials who have been involved in repressions or election fraud. And it's a good idea to do it in tranches, as Carl Bildt says. I hope the European Union makes a quick decision, and I hope that decision is not the last one. With respect to Russia, it obviously is a little trickier. The United States and Europe coordinated its sanctions on Russia after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014. These included individual, but also broader economic, so-called sectoral sanctions. We did it. They had an important impact. They limited Putin's aggression in Ukraine. Having done it for Ukraine, we should be prepared to consider it with respect to Belarus, not to actually launch these sanctions, but to prepare them. And in this, I may disagree with Ambassador Siebert. I think it is useful for the Russian authorities to know that the United States and the European Union are prepared to take steps. We can't bluff. What we say we're prepared to do if they invade, we should actually be willing to do. And I think having contingency sanctions, maybe not spelled out in precise detail, but spelled out with enough specificity so they know we're serious, can be a good idea. And I think preparing them is useful. The threshold. Well, okay, let's try to unpack this issue. If the Russian army moves into Belarus, that's one thing. But it's more likely that it would be a combination of little green men and Russian forces augmenting Belarusian forces, or even in Belarusian uniform. In that more likely case, we should still prepare to move. We could impose individual sanctions against Russians, for example, the propagandists who are taking over Belarusian TV. But I also think that preparation for sectoral sanctions on a contingency basis can be useful, and it may be that we want to prepare some in the event the Russians move in a hybrid fashion. We should not, right now, the United States and Europe ought to be talking about this and coming up with a combined position. We're much, much better off if we're doing this together. And frankly, as a former American official, I'd rather do less with Europe than more unilaterally. I think that would be a strong message of unity. But let's face it, sanctions are not going to be the decisive issue. Okay, the decisive issue, I think, will be the will of the Belarusian people over time. And although this is not like Ukraine in 2014, it's a little bit like Poland in August 1980. It's a little bit like the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, in 2004. And it's, it's going to unfold according to its own logic. And we ought to be prepared to help Belarusian society in the long term. Carl Bildt's right. We don't have to talk about the specifics, but the United States and Europe have good experience supporting civil activism and free media. And we ought to back up the people who are risking a lot on behalf of values which we all share.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I know, Prime Minister Bildt, that you will have a lot to say about the sanctions on Russia and how to time them properly. I would also want you to very briefly touch on the fate of the Eastern Partnership and Belarusian membership in it from your perspective, how it could look like, but also about the, a little bit unpack the support for civil society. Ambassador Free just mentioned the free media. We all know that for example, Radio Free Europe was one of the very few sources that could provide the rather comprehensive coverage on Belarus, of course, together with Belsat. Both of the channels are functioning from abroad. So if you have some thoughts on how best structure the support for civil society, that would be very much appreciated.
Well, a couple of comments on a couple of issues, and I certainly try to answer those as well. But calling Minsk or calling Moscow, yeah. I mean, talking Lukashenko, yeah, sort of he didn't take the call of Angela Merkel, but not quite certain it would have been that useful. But call the foreign minister. Foreign Minister Mackay wrote a letter to the EU foreign minister. I think every EU foreign minister should call him and say, hi, what are you up to? Call the prime minister. He's a new guy. I haven't a clue who he is. He came in June. But we should sort of call all of those officials that are reachable so that they understand the message and understand that this is not going to go away. I think that's important. On the sanctions Belarus, yeah, I think we agree this sort of step by step. And I think it's very important that the EU should sort of announce that one is prepared to do more, not if the things deteriorate, but also if it doesn't improve. So that we, until we see an improvement, are prepared to step up. Each step can be fairly small, but the fact that it's seen as a long-term thing, and no one in Belarus can be fairly certain if they're going to be on the list tomorrow. And that's the important thing, the fear factor that they will be on the list. Once on the list, it's another issue. On other sanctions, Belarus, what Dan refers to as sectoral sanctions. I mean, the economy is in shambles before. It's a very weak economy. It's a moderately reformed Soviet economy. And of course, the Russians have been fed up with it for a long time because they have to bail it out now and then. And of course, what we have been doing, particularly the US lately, but also Lithuania, have been helping the Belarus economy to withstand some of the measures taken by Russia. When Secretary Pompeo was there in March, for example, one of the things was that US oil deliveries to the refineries in order to make them go because Russian deliveries were not going as well. And so we have a balancing act here. Sectoral sanctions can take down the Belarus economy. It is not the Russian economy. It is the Belarus economy. Sectoral sanction can take it down. But that's something that immediately would have Belarus to end up the care of the Kremlin. So it's a somewhat double-edged sword. But I think for the worst of contingencies, if we have a very heavy clampdown violent by Lukashenko, we should take down his economy, come whatever. I mean, there should be some order. We should not forget that Lukashenko is distinctly unpopular in Moscow. I would guess that there are different camps in Moscow. I mean, there's clearly the paranoid camp that believes that sort of any sort of deal with this opposition means that we will have the US Army marching into Smolensk tomorrow. And there are those fairly paranoid people around. But there are also those saying, Lukashenko is a thug, he's unreliable, we don't really like him. And if we tie ourselves to the mast of Lukashenko, there's a risk of Belarus public opinion going the way of Ukraine long term, turning anti-Russian in a way they are not. And that is not in the long-term interest of Russia. So perhaps the moderate Kremlin view would be, well, stabilize the situation at the moment, and then we engineer some sort of transition to some sort of reasonable guy that could also open up to the West. But how that would going to play out remains to be seen. On the what we can do, Belsat was mentioned. I mean, Belsat is one of the things that we've done. It's not been entirely cheap, I can tell you. But anyhow, and other things. Telegram is, of course, a special issue. But there are issues related to that as well. It's originally, as we know, a Russian system. The Russians have been trying to stop it. They failed. It's now run from Poland, and is highly significant. But there are other things that can be done as well. Eastern Partnership, I think, is an instrument that should be used. In the Eastern Partnership, you have three sort of democracies, and you have Belarus and Azerbaijan. But I think why don't call a meeting of the Eastern Partnership foreign ministers, with the High Representative, Mr. Borrell there, not with the entire crowd, and perhaps do it in Yerevan. Because one of the templates here is clearly what happened in the spring of 2018 in Armenia, where sort of a popular rebellion, or whatever we call it, popular manifestation, led to a change. And I'm quite certain that sort of Moscow was nervous for a while, but Moscow noted that in terms of their basic security interest, that was not the issue. It didn't change. And they accepted a significant change in Armenia. So it might be that Yerevan, Kiev, Chisinau to a certain extent, can play a role here as well in long-term working for these particular changes. Have I answered all questions?
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. I think so, and I think we also will have time for probably one or two more questions. And for the first one, I'm going to bring in a participant from the audio, with the video call, who is going to ask the question.
Hi, it's Paul Taylor here in France. Good evening good afternoon, good morning to you three gentlemen. My question is that what's happening in Belarus is it comes against the backdrop of something that's been going on for more than 20 years, which is a contest between Russia and the West for ascendancy in what you might call the gray zone of the former Soviet republics that dwell between Russia and NATO and the European Union. And while several of you have said we don't want to bring in geopolitics, that is there, that's in the room, and it affects Russian thinking just as it affects our thinking. Question, as part of an attempt to diffuse this and allow the Belarusian people to actually get what they're after, which is clean, fair elections and an end to tyranny, wouldn't it make sense for us to state a bit more clearly that where neither Russia nor the EU is looking to take in Belarus? And if that worked there, perhaps it might work in other countries in the region where we've made rash promises that we're unable to keep. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And since we will have to be wrapping up in about 6 minutes, I'll add one more question from the participants. And the question is about the lessons learned from the past rounds of sanctions. What we learned, what works, what doesn't work, and whether it makes sense to introduce the sanctions again. And I will start this time from the other end, and please try to fit your remarks in about 2 minutes. Prime Minister Bildt.
Well, on sanctions, we do have previous experience with sanctions in Belarus after previous elections, and where we had targeted sanctions, and we said we're going to have them as long as you don't release political prisoners. Political prisoners were released. It took some time, but with a couple of other factors, it did work. So it is not useless. On Paul Taylor's question, I wouldn't phrase it like that. This is a question of democracy. This is a question of human rights, nothing else. It is up to the people of Belarus to choose their political orientation. I think what we could state is that the security arrangements that are there between Russia and Belarus, they have a couple of air defense fighters, they have strategic communication stations, they have a highly significant air defense or strategic early warning facility there. We have no objections to that because these are clearly defensive installations, and you can see the defensive security interests that Moscow has. But that is a decision to be taken by Belarus and by Moscow. It is not something that we have views on, but we certainly don't have any objections to them, because we see them as, in their present form, distinctly non-threatening.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. And Ambassador Fried, we're back to sanctions again and to geopolitics versus the determination of the people.
Right. First, I agree with Carl Bildt. We should not, and I'll put it this way, we should not be in a hurry to start drawing lines on a map. It would be a poor response to the Belarusians' demand for free elections if we said that we were going to essentially consign them to Russia's sphere of influence. It's not, that is not the issue. It's about free elections. The Belarusian people have not challenged their relations with Moscow. Therefore, we need not raise that issue whatsoever. And we certainly need not give the Russians something which they don't deserve, which is a recognition that they are, that Belarus in some sense belongs to them. Belarus belongs to the Belarusian people, full stop. They do not demand anything more than free elections and the right to run their own country. And that's where we ought to leave things. With respect to sanctions, look, I do not look at sanctions as a magic problem solver. They can be a useful tool to advance a policy that otherwise makes sense. And our policy ought to be united. It ought to seek support of the Belarusian people for the short term and the long term, combined with cautionary notes to Moscow. I'll be interested to see what conclusions Steve Biegun makes after his trips. He's one of the Trump administration officials committed to working with Europe and on behalf of reasonable policies to advance basic human rights. So that's a good start. We need to get ourselves lined up behind the Belarusian people, not ahead of them and certainly not undercutting them.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. This is indeed a very difficult situation because for the Belarusian people themselves, it was not a geopolitical election from the point of view whether people were expressing their views towards the US, EU or Russia or other external forces. It was indeed a very purely internal situation, but definitely for the countries around it, it's a very geopolitical question which has to be squared with the principle of the self-determination of people. And Ambassador Zibert, for your concluding word, besides the question that were addressed, I would also ask you to reflect a little bit on how a geopolitical commission and geopolitical European Union can square this line that we want to be both geopolitical, but at the same time actively are saying that this issue is not a geopolitical and we need to leave the future of their countries in the hands of the people.
Yeah, that is an interesting way you formulate your question. I think these two things in here are not directly linked. I fully agree with Ambassador Dan Fried that Belarus is not about geopolitics at the moment. It may be kind of the elephant in the room for many people thinking about the situation, but the people there should be supported in their endeavor to get freedom, free elections and civil participation. And we should not raise a question that is not raised by them. So with Moscow, the messaging should be very clear. We have talked about possible sanctions, etc. I think now it's the time for messaging to Moscow, which is being done. And I'm sure that Moscow also understands the linkages between their role in Belarus, their own internal situation, the costs that any interference may have internally and also vis-a-vis people in Belarus. I think these are important topics. Economic sanctions, I would be very careful, maybe as it has been said, a last resort against Belarus, because it would hit the population and the opposition as well. This is not what we should look at the moment. Rather, we should try to use any chance to help for a national dialogue, for a situation maybe as in Armenia. Certainly Belarus is located in a different position on the globe than Armenia, and the relationship with Moscow is different, but that could be a way. I wish that what has been said, that it looks a little bit like Poland in 1980 and Kiev in 2006. I hope it is not too much like Prague 1968. We have to work for that. And we should keep all possibilities open to reconnect to the country whenever the situation evolves in a positive direction, and to continue the dialogue. And we should look at the Eastern Partnership in that vein, that we retarget it a little bit now in order to help the society and to allow for further contacts whenever the situation improves in Belarus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Indeed, Belarusian people have already shown their ability to choose their own way, and despite the fact that there are many parallels that can be drawn with other scenarios, we do hope that the situation will be resolved similar to all the positive cases, and probably learning from the mistakes that were learned in the negative cases. But thank you very much for the great conversation today. We unpacked a lot of important questions. I would also like to thank all the speakers and participants of today's conference. This is the last session of today, but we're definitely looking forward to having you with us tomorrow and on Friday. We start tomorrow at 1:30 Central European Time, and we will be talking about Chinese relative rise and American relative decline in the world. That's a provocative statement, but also during the day we will cover a range of various issues, starting from European strategic autonomy to automation, future of work, and other issues. And a preview for everybody who is listening to the current session, we will most likely have a very special speaker from Belarus joining us on Friday. So please stay with us for the next 2 days. Thank you for your participation today, and have a wonderful evening.